Just a reminder for you that all of the information in this podcast series comes from the book, The Biblical Design of a Healthy Church. In that book, you are going to learn the 2-4-6 methodology of how to structure your church based on the scriptural model. 2, that means the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. 4 is the 4 types of growth in the church, the 4 focus concerns that you should have. That is spiritual growth and ministry development, missions expansion, outreach effectiveness, really in that order. That becomes the growth cycle that we want to move people through. And as we build people, the ministry then grows. And then the 6, so 2, 4, 6 functions of the church: worship, discipleship, ministry, evangelism, fellowship, and prayer. Of course, you're going to learn about living by design, not default, and with intention. There are lessons in there about conflict and how to manage it. There are so many other elements in there that help support that 2, 4, 6. But when you break it down, leading in a church, let's say this, it's not easy, but the structure of the biblical design is simple. That biblical design will tell you the what, so that you can really be a transformational leader. It will tell you the what, and then you step into God's desire, His design, and His specific direction for you to start figuring out prayerfully and in the power of the Holy Spirit how to implement the methodology, the how. So the biblical design of a healthy church, the what, and then you move into the how. But we want to begin with first things first. All the information on the biblical design of a healthy church is in the show notes there below. Hey friend, welcome back to the Lifelines podcast. I'm Andy Jenkins and I'm here at the kitchen table with my dad, Edwin. Today, we're going to dialogue with you about 6 things churches do, the 6 functions of a church. Well, or maybe they're the 6 things churches should do. Now, here's what I want you to listen for. We're not going to tell you how to do it. We're going to tell you what to do. Here's the unique angle on the biblical design of a healthy church. That's the book that Dad's been putting together, which comes from a book that he had put together, about 25 years ago, which came from some articles that were published in the Alabama Baptist newspaper, which came from some articles he had written while he was leading in the Office of Leadership and Church Growth at the Alabama Baptist State Board of Missions. Okay, so the unique angle, and all the information about that book and some of the other training opportunities are down below in the show notes for you, by the way. Every week we put some next best steps for you based on the content that we've shared. So here's the angle. So often we get tied up in methodology. How should we do certain things? And so after a while, we start looking at the methods some other people are using and the methods they're using and the methods they use. And pretty soon, rather than getting back to the core question of why and the even bigger question of what should we do, we're just working on the how. Now, it's not that you don't need a how. And it's not that you shouldn't learn from others and even implement what they're doing. But in the hustle of it all, we do want to make sure that we're doing the right things. And we do want to make sure they're the things that God has led you specifically to do in the unique location where you're serving. That's why we hit that what is God's desire, what is God's design, and what is God's unique direction for us. Some things for us all are the same, but the implementation may be different. That's really what this is. The 6 things, the 6 functions of a church are the same, regardless of where you're serving. However, implementation may be a little bit different. That means we don't want to go straight to implementation. We want to look back and make sure that we are doing the 6 functions that healthy churches do. And then all of the programs, all of our planning, all of the processes, including budgeting our time and money of how things get done, all of the policies and procedures that you have to have. You have to have some rules and operating guidelines of how you behave, and how people just move the ball down the field in an organization where you got multiple people serving. All of that should flow into or flow from the 6 functions that we see in Acts 2:42 through 47, which we'll highlight in these 2 episodes. But also, we see these functions all throughout the New Testament. So, in this 2-part talk, we're going to begin dialoguing about how these 6 all fit together, and then how they don't just function on their own, they actually feed and fuel each other. All right, so here's the conversation with my father, Edwin. Way back in episode 1, the first one of the series, we really dialogued about the definition of a church. And we said this: a healthy church is a biblically functioning community of believers committed to Jesus Christ. And then we really, in that episode, talked about, just quickly enumerated 6 things that healthy churches do. So they're biblically functioning. What are the functions of that church? Well, that's what we want to talk about today. There are 6 of them. Let me list them off, and then I want you to start rolling into them.
Okay,
and I've got
fine.
a couple of questions. Yeah. Number 1, worship. Number 2, discipleship. Now, we talked all about discipleship in a previous episode. Number 3, ministry. We hit that as well because that is one of the goals of discipleship. Number 4, evangelism. 5, fellowship. 6, prayer. I'm going to list them all down in the show notes below for you, but here they are one more time: worship, discipleship, ministry, evangelism, fellowship, and prayer. So a couple questions to kick this conversation off. Where do you find these functions, and which one's the most important? Where do you even start?
Well, of course, we've talked about this, and the place that I discovered these listed so carefully was in Acts chapter 2, verses 41 through 47. It is at the time of the Pentecost where the church came into being, and inside of the statements that are recorded there, written by the Apostle Luke, Luke, the physician, Luke, in Acts 2, 41 through 47, that's the earliest account of the church actually coming into being. And so we look at that, and that's where we find worship, discipleship, ministry, evangelism, fellowship, and prayer. Now, sometimes we get to a point where we ask the question, what does your church do best? And some churches say, well, we do this and we do this very well, but we don't do this very well. We do this very well. For instance, a church may say, we have marvelous buildings, but we don't really have the most vibrant fellowship that we ought to have. And then some churches will say, well, we have a vibrant fellowship, but our buildings are in bad condition. Others will say, well, we're a church that we have a wonderful location, but we just really don't know where we're going as a church. And so the result has been that our church has not been healthy or growing or really ministering to the marvelous location that we have. So the idea of analyzing and looking at the functions of the church will help us to find out what is God's desire, design, and potentially direction in regard to each church. I believe that each church should have, to a degree and in the proper balance, all 6 of the functions of the church. A church, to be a church, certainly will have worship and discipleship. Those are the Great Commandment, Great Commission. And then ministry, as we've talked about that. Ministry, every person, every member being a minister. And then evangelism, that's reaching people for Christ. And fellowship, the church is not really a vitally functioning community of believers unless they have fellowship within the church. And prayer. Sometimes people have said, well, prayer goes into all of those things. I agree. It goes into each of the other 5 functions, but also it in its own right should be regarded as a function of the church. In fact, I think that when we do not make it a function of the church, Andrew, I think that we go far missing in terms of what we ought to be doing as a church, because prayer is something and is an issue upon which we can really build virtually everything we do as a church. So it is a function of the church. So those are the functions. I think that we need to have those in the appropriate balance that God directs for any given church. Now, some churches may emphasize one or the other more than maybe 2 or 3 of the others, but there is a need for all of these elements in order for it to be a truly New Testament functioning church.
So you got to have a viable, just like with the human body, for it to actually be a human body, you got to have a viable amount for it to actually be alive and thriving.
That's right. That's right.
So at some level, you could think, well, which one of these is the most important? Well, we could make the argument and theologically nuance it in multiple directions. However, it's not so much that argument as it is, how do we apply it and make sure we're doing each of these things at the appropriate level in the right balance, which again may look different for a different church. Here's something that it just kind of struck me as we're putting the pieces together of, now being into this about 9 different talks. Really, when we come to the functions of the church, the 6 functions, we're really talking about the what we do.
That's right.
Okay, this is what we do.
Correct.
We're not prescribing for people how to do it.
No.
And the New Testament church, I was reading here Acts 2:41 through 47. This is right when the church is birthed. I mean, this is immediate.
Yes.
So I'm just going to read it and point it out so people go, where are you guys grabbing this? And then keep making some observations. Then those who gladly received his word. So Peter stands up and preaches is what occurs. Those who gladly receive the word, it's evangelism. They're baptized. It's an act of worship. And that day, about 3,000 souls are added to the church. So they come into the fellowship, into the community. And they continue steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. So that's discipleship. And in fellowship, that's fellowship. In the breaking of bread. So that could be worship. That could also be ministry. You could even say, well, that could be fellowship too. And in prayers. So there's that one. That one is the clearest. Then fear or awe came upon every soul. Worship and prayer right there. And many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. So there's ministry. Now all who believed were together, fellowship, and had all things in common, ministry, and sold their possessions and goods, discipleship, and divided them among all, that's ministry, as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord, that's fellowship in the temple, worship and prayer, and breaking bread from house to house, that's ministry. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, it's discipleship. Praising God, that's worship, and having favor with all the people, fellowship. And the Lord added to the church daily, it's discipleship, those who were being saved, evangelism. All right there, it tells us again the what. These are the things they did, but it doesn't tell us the how. So it leaves us discretion on how do we implement those in our unique context, which then takes us back to that discussion we had about tapping into God's desire, God's design, what's God's specific direction for you on this?
And you took the words right out of my mouth, because the God's desire, design, direction can be somewhat unique, but at the same course, it is not totally unique with each church, but it does follow a definite design of God. And that was obvious when the church came into being. Now, we go back to Matthew 16, 13 through 19, when Jesus was asking his disciples, who do men say that I am? And the question was answered ultimately by Simon Peter when he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said back to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And he said, upon this rock I will build my church. And the key there is that the church belongs to Jesus. And he is going to build his church on the confession of persons like Simon Peter, who have that revealed from God to them. Now, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And so often we jump past that and say, okay, now wait a minute. I am saying, now wait a minute. What about the fact that God revealed it? God reveals his desire, his design, his direction in various ways. And a part of it is that the church is to be built upon the rock of the testimony of you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He is the head of the church. And later on, we're going to find out more specifically when we get to the book of Ephesians chapter 5, that he is the head of the church. He is the head of the body. And so that's very important for us to realize that he is the head and we are members of that body carrying out the functions of the church.
That was a good word right there where you highlighted it's supernatural revelation, Jesus said, that starts the church.
Yes.
Okay, so he said, on this rock, flesh didn't reveal this, my Father revealed this to you. And then at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit falls when the church is birthed. So I think that leads us right into where we've been talking about functioning intentionally, not functioning accidentally, not functioning incidentally. Talked about that several talks ago. But with intention, if revelation starts it, then revelation really needs to dictate how you continue it.
Exactly.
So you've got these functions: worship, ministry, discipleship, evangelism, fellowship, prayer. What we really are encouraging people to do, if they're leading in a church, they're building a church, they're joining a church, they're collectively coming together as a church, is not just to jump to a human blueprint.
Exactly.
Even if it was a godly person that created it.
That's right.
Without going, okay, why are we doing this? Is this God's unique direction for us right here? But to go back and make sure there's revelation specific for you on that.
Exactly. This is where I need to say a word that we have a tendency to say, well, what is your vision for our church? And what is your vision for our church? And what is your vision for our church? And sometimes pastor search committees and pastor search teams sometimes ask someone who is being considered as pastor, well, what would your vision be for our church? I don't believe that a human being can have a vision for a church of which they are not a part. I think that the vision has to come from God through the people and through the church and in the heart of the one who might be called as pastor. In other words, you don't come to a place where you have not been and bring what you want to do in that church. It is Christ's church. He's still the head. It is according to God's desire, design, and direction. Therefore, it is God's vision for the church that is the most important thing. What does God want that church to do in the locality where that church finds itself? And so that's very important for us to realize. God gives the vision to the church. Who does he give the vision to? Only to the pastor? No, he gives it to the whole body. I believe wholeheartedly in congregational polity, but I believe that the pastor is the under shepherd. He is a gift to the church. And I believe that there are those others that we mentioned in Ephesians chapter 4 that work also in the church to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And the body itself, the members of the body itself, discern together under the leadership, I probably should say, of the pastor, what God is saying to that church.
Well, if you look through the book of Acts, that is really what happened when God seems to speak the clearest about the direction of a church, of a body. He certainly speaks to individuals, but there's something unique that happens when that church comes together. He sets aside, Paul's first missionary trip while the church is gathered together, while they're worshiping. Out of the overflow of one of these functions comes direction and vision. That happens multiple times throughout the scripture. And I do think that as you start moving into all these functions, you do see that it's not just the pastors that are called. It's not just the pastors that do these functions. Everybody does. There's a certain role that everybody has and an importance to it. And maybe just sometimes we get off track on how we view church and how we view the roles of people. So let's talk a bit, as we did a moment ago, in terms of implementing a model of church.
Okay.
Right now, there are several different models out there. And I remember back when I was in seminary, Rick Warren, Saddleback Church, Purpose-Driven Church, that book had just come out.
Yes.
He was starting at that point to lead conferences, had done it for about 3-4 years at that point. It was in the middle 90s. Churches from all over were going to learn. And when you got there, he would teach you what they were doing.
Yes.
But then he would say from the stage, don't just go copy this. And he would also say, hey, anything I've got, you can take it and you don't have to get my permission to use it, because God gave it to us and it's the kingdom's. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of us. So he kind of was tiptoeing both sides, saying anything I have, you can have it, but don't just copy it. And then lots of people went out and just copied it.
Yes, exactly. And I think he was very sincere in saying that, because he went out to Saddleback Church and just started something basically from scratch.
Right.
And God just blessed it. And he had laid it upon the heart of Rick Warren to go and start a church that was really different. And it was a different type of approach to church. And it became one of the great churches in the United States at that time. And God used it in a mighty, mighty way. I agree with you. I think that we need to look at this and to be committed to prayer. I believe that most of us can grow in our prayer lives. No matter how much we're praying, I think that we can probably pray more and pray more effectively and more deeply than we are praying. Even now, sometimes we say, well, I don't want to make you feel guilty about your prayer. I don't want anybody to feel guilty about prayer. I just want them to pray. And I just want to pray myself and pray more and more and to come to love that more and more in relationship to God. And so we pray about these things and then we pursue these things. I think that the 6 functions are so very important. Even though we've talked about some of these things, I think that it's very important for us to be sure that we're a church that knows we must worship. We must worship. The most important thing, as I've shared with many people, is that in my life is that I worship. And every one of us worship. Every one of us worship. What does that mean? It means that we are giving worth to something outside of ourselves. And some people worship God and some people do not worship God. But I believe that everyone ultimately worships. They have a focus. They have a priority in their lives. And someone has said that perhaps it's that which we think about most, or that to which we devote ourselves when we are not devoted to anything else in competition with that to which we devote ourselves. So worship involves all those things. It involves time and talent and even treasure and trust. It involves our according worth to something outside of ourselves. We can find out really what we worship most when we look at what interests us most. What is our interest? What is important to us? What is our involvement? What is it that we invest in? All of those things can lead us to an awareness of what we worship.
I've created a resource that I would like to direct your attention to. The name of the resource is Gear Up. It is crafted to help you leverage technology to clarify your mission, to communicate a plan, to develop fully devoted disciples, and create a movement that makes an everlasting impact. Now, is the resource for you? It is if you believe the church in any of its expressions is the hope of the world. It's also for you if you believe that Jesus meant it when he said that we would do greater works than he did, John 14:12. And it's for you if you believe the gospel is a timeless message of good news that works for anyone, everywhere, Matthew 28:18-20. But you need a way to help people find and fulfill their purpose, and you want to clearly communicate that process, a discipleship pathway, so that you can grow people and make a bigger impact. Well, all of the information is in Gear Up, and you're going to learn uniquely about how different elements fit together in the church. You're going to learn the importance of the processes that you have. You're going to learn the importance of the place, the environment, the importance of the people, and how everyone literally needs volunteer or staff a job description, not to restrain them, but so that they know exactly what the win is and how to implement those processes that you have in place to move ministry forward. You'll learn about finances and what we call the purse, of how, again, everything uniquely working together. And then, of course, we're going to dialogue ultimately about the path, the discipleship framework that you're going to use to move people from where they are to where God has designed them to be. And then we'll wrap this all in the technology. You know, you might have wondered, should our church go online? Should we be live on Facebook and Instagram? And what do we do with social media? Or should we do email and text? And oh man, there's so much confusion out there. And I'm going to be honest, after looking at it and studying multiple churches, really, the technology has never been easier than it is now if you have the right processes in place and if you don't lead with the technology. Two of the mistakes that I see churches often make is leading with the technology and then not having the right processes in place. And as a result, you don't lead with the discipleship framework. You don't lead with the path of changed lives and the transformation. And so many tech teams, they just waste so much time. And with the right steps in place, this can be something that enhances ministry and is easy, not something that honestly just becomes another thing that you feel like you've got to do. So the Gear Up resources, they'll help you lead the church well, they'll help you organize and structure, and then they'll help you wrap the technology into, infuse through all of that to communicate it. To learn more about that, just click the link down in the show notes below.